Before he ever touched a wrench, Carroll Shelby was told he was living on borrowed time, a heart condition that doctors said would kill him young, a chicken farm in East Texas that barely paid the bills, and a hunger for speed that made absolutely no medical sense. Most men in that position would have settled. Shelby went racing instead, and not just racing, winning. The kind of winning that makes the automotive world stop and stare. But here's the thing about Carroll Shelby that most people miss. The cars he's famous for weren't his greatest act. His greatest act was the one nobody saw coming, the one nobody saw at all, until a dusty canvas was pulled back in a private warehouse after his death, and the automotive world came face to face with something that had no right to exist. Carroll Shelby spent decades doing what the corporate world told him couldn't be done. When health issues ended his driving career in the early 1960s, he didn't hang up his gloves. He looked at American V8 power sitting inside soft, heavy bodies and European chassis that handled beautifully but lacked punch, and decided to put the two together in a way nobody had tried seriously before. The result was the Cobra, a car that didn't just win races, it humiliated Ferrari on the world stage and rewrote what American performance meant. That alone would have been enough for most people. Shelby wasn't most people. He followed the Cobra with the GT350, then the GT40, both born from his partnership with Ford, both designed to win at the highest level of motorsport. The GT40 went to Le Mans in 1966 and finished first, second, and third, ending Ferrari's dominance in one of the most famous moments in racing history. Shelby's fingerprints were all over it, and yet, even with that legacy cemented, he kept moving. Dodge, Toyota, independent projects. He never stayed long enough for anyone to put a fence around him. And he never stopped questioning what the next build could look like. What his close associates knew, and what the public rarely heard, was that Shelby held a quiet bitterness toward corporate interference. During early GT500 development, he reportedly walked out of meetings over power restrictions and emissions rules. His consulting work on the Dodge Viper turned contentious over steering systems, weight targets, and safety features he considered unnecessary compromises. One former fabricator who worked with him in the late 1990s put it plainly. Carroll said if Ford didn't have the guts, he'd do it in his own damn garage. Nobody laughed, because they all knew he meant it. And that's exactly what he did. Tucked away on private land in rural Texas, far from the Las Vegas showroom that tourists visit and collectors photograph, Shelby maintained a second space. No brochures mentioned it. No interviews referenced it. Even close confidants had barely stepped inside. Utilitarian structure, sparse surroundings, fluorescent lights, the kind of place built for work rather than display. After Shelby's death in 2012, the estate team began the long process of cataloging everything he owned. Most of it was well documented. Then they reached this particular warehouse, and the documentation stopped making sense. Under a plain gray canvas, tied to the steering column with a wrinkled paper tag that read "Exp Shelby, do not move," sat a car that matched nothing in any official record. No Shelby badge, no Ford paperwork, no VIN that corresponded to anything registered or logged. What the canvas had been protecting was a low, wide, aggressive coupe, angular and muscular, with bodywork formed entirely from hand-shaped aluminum. Not a single panel came from a production line. The roofline sat lower than anything in the Shelby catalog. The stance was wider. The proportions were something between a Daytona coupe and a fever dream. Automotive historians and engineers brought in to assess it determined the car was almost certainly built on a heavily modified Fox body Mustang platform, likely mid-1990s in origin. The chassis had been stretched and reworked to the point where the original architecture was nearly unrecognizable. What lived underneath the bodywork shocked everyone in the room. A twin-turbocharged V8 configuration that Shelby had discussed in concept conversations over the years but never formally developed, mated to a custom transmission setup, and an experimental rear-mounted cooling system, unlike anything documented in Shelby American's history. Crude notes written in marker covered various components. Shelby EXP V8 twin, test rack only. On the firewall, someone, likely Shelby himself, had written 4 words, not for production. The car had no airbags. No emissions equipment. Nothing designed for a showroom or a street. Parts had been sourced from scrap test mules, discontinued Ford engineering prototypes, and components that had no business being in the same build together. A skeleton crew had assembled on nights and weekends, under strict instruction to keep no written records and say nothing to anyone. One former team member, speaking anonymously out of loyalty to Shelby's memory, confirmed the project had a name inside that small circle, the Ghost. Nobody wrote it down. That was the point. What Shelby appeared to be building was a spiritual successor to the Cobra Daytona coupe. the streamlined endurance racer that nearly took on Ferrari at Le Mans in 1964. That car had been about removing everything unnecessary and letting raw performance do the talking. And this prototype carried the same philosophy forward by 30 years, without asking anyone's permission. The Daytona Coupe had been built to a deadline and a race calendar. This build had neither. It answered only to the man who conceived it, and he answered to nobody. Those who knew Shelby in his later years describe a man dealing with mounting health complications, heart issues, mobility limitations, and exhaustion that came and went unpredictably. And still, according to the people who were there, he came to the garage, not for press, not for cameras. He arrived with a sketch pad, a cutting torch, and the same instincts that had beaten Ferrari in the 1960s. Building wasn't something Shelby did for applause. It was the thing that kept him going when everything else was running down. The car's discovery has triggered a legal and ethical standoff that nobody has resolved publicly. Ownership of the vehicle sits in uncertain territory because it appears in no official estate records, which raises questions about intellectual property, given that it carries Shelby's name and was built using Ford-derived components without any authorization from Ford's engineering or legal teams. If the car were ever titled, registered, or sent to auction, Ford's legal standing in the matter would become immediate and complicated. Emissions compliance, crash certification, and basic registration are all impossible without documentation that simply doesn't exist. By every regulatory standard currently in place, this vehicle cannot legally exist on a public road. Private collector circles have already placed informal estimates on its potential auction value, with some figures reaching north of $10 million, but those conversations remain purely theoretical. The car has not been restored. No official unveiling has been announced. Sources connected to the estate indicate there are no immediate plans to display it publicly, and based on what those closest to Shelby understood about him, that outcome would have suited him perfectly. He didn't build to be validated. He built because the alternative, which was sitting still and accepting limits, was something Carroll Shelby had never once been able to do. What this prototype represents, beyond its mechanical specifications and its complicated legal status, is a particular kind of statement about how great builders actually operate. Every car in the official Shelby catalog passed through corporate review, legal approval, emissions testing, and market analysis before the public ever saw it. This one bypassed every single layer of that process, deliberately and completely. No target demographic, no product strategy, no sign-off from anyone wearing a suit, just a man in his 70s, working through the night on an idea that the industry would never have approved, and that was precisely why he never asked. Young builders and designers who have encountered this story through the collector community have started calling it the Black File car, a reference to classified projects that technically don't exist in any official record. The name fits. Carroll Shelby spent 60 years building cars that changed the way the world understood American performance, and then he spent his final years building one that the world wasn't supposed to know about. The Cobra roared, the GT40 roared. This one sits in silence, under guard, waiting for a decision that nobody seems ready to make. What lingers after this story settles isn't the mystery of the build itself, though that's real enough. It's the image of the man. Carroll Shelby, a Texas chicken farmer with a bad heart who talked his way into racing, beat the best teams in the world on their own turf, reshaped American muscle car culture from the ground up, and then, when everyone assumed the chapter was closed, slipped away to a quiet warehouse and started building something new, something he never intended to share, something that only came to light because doors eventually get opened and canvases eventually get pulled back. The most powerful thing he ever built may be the one he never finished, never named, and never showed a single journalist. And now that it's been found, it raises a question that applies far beyond automotive history. If Carroll Shelby still had one more secret left after everything he gave the world, then the builders and creators who feel like they've already said everything they have to say might want to reconsider. Greatness doesn't announce its final chapter. Sometimes it just keeps working quietly in a garage nobody knows about until the lights finally go out.